So here are the notes for 8.6. We're going to do a part 1 and part 2. So this is going to be part 1 of our 8.6 notes. So for 8.6, it is all about solving rational equations. For part 1, how we're going to solve rational equations is by cross multiplication. So what you're going to see for these examples is you're going to have one fraction equal to another. And then we're going to cross multiply and solve for the variable. This should kind of look similar, especially like when in geometry, when you guys had, once again, one fraction equals another, and you guys cross multiplied with those ratios. So we're going to do the same thing here. So let's look at example 1. We have 3 over x plus 1 equals 9 over 4x plus 5. Okay, so since we have one fraction equals another fraction, this is where we're going to cross multiply. So I'm going to take my 3 and I'm going to multiply it by the 4x plus 5. So I'm going to write it here. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my other side. So I'm going to have 9 times my x plus 1. And notice that when I do multiply that I'm using parentheses because my 9 and 3, I have to multiply by both of the terms there. So like my 9, I have to multiply by both the 1 and the x, and my 3, I have to multiply by both the 4x and 5. So please be careful with that. Now the reason we can cross multiply here, and we didn't do it when we actually multiplied, right, with our rational expressions, is because there is an equal. So anytime there is an equal sign and one fraction is on one side and another fraction is on the other, that's when you can cross multiply. So be careful with that as well. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and distribute my 3 to the 4x and to the 5. So I get 12x plus 15. And that's going to equal my 9x plus 9. And so now all I have to do is just solve for x. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract my 9x from both sides. And when I do that, I get now a 3x plus 15 equals 1. And then from there, oh, sorry, that should be 9, not 1. That's my mistake. This should be 9. This should be 9. There we go. Yeah, since we distribute that 9 to both the x and 1. Okay, so now I'm going to subtract 15 from both sides. And I get 3x equals negative 6, so be careful with your negatives and positives. Then I divide both sides by 3, and then I'm going to get x equals negative 2. Now before I box that as my answer, when we solve rational equations, we have to check for what is called extraneous solutions. This is when we get an answer, but when we plug it back into the original problem, it does not work. So how we're going to figure out if we have any extraneous solution is by taking our x value, or we could get multiple values, and we're going to plug them back into the denominator. The idea is that as long as we don't get a 0 in the denominator, then that answer works, so it is a solution. So we're going to take negative 2 and plug it into the first denominator, so I have negative 2 plus 1. So when I do that, I get negative 1. Well, that works because we don't get 0. So now I'm going to check it in my second denominator. I do 4 times negative 2. That gives me negative 8. And then plus 5, that gives me negative 3. So that works because we don't get 0. Remember, we do not want 0 in the denominator because anytime we have 0 in the denominator, that creates it to be undefined. So like if we have 3 divided by 0, you can't plug that in your calculator. It's going to say error. So that's what we always have to check for whenever we solve rational equations. So we have to make sure we don't get 0 when we plug our solutions back into the original equation. We don't get 0 in the denominator. Okay, so now what I would like you to do is go ahead and pause the video and try number 2. Okay, let's go ahead and go over this. So once again, since we have an equal sign and one fraction on one side, another fraction on the other, we're going to cross multiply. I'm going to go ahead and do negative 4 times x minus 3. And then I'm going to do my 5 times x plus 3. Don't forget to make sure you use parentheses, because if not, you're not going to distribute those values correctly or multiply. So now I'm going to have negative 4 and multiply by x, and same thing with the negative 3. So I'm going to get negative 4x plus 12, because negative 4 times a negative 3 gives me a 12. And then I do the same thing with my 5. So I get 5x plus 15. This time I did that part correctly. Oops, let's write a 15, not 13. So make sure you distribute those values correctly. So now we're going to solve. I like to keep my x positive, so I'm going to go ahead and add 4x to both sides, just because I always find it a little bit easier to keep my x's positive. Okay, I'm going to go to the side here because I'm running out of room. So now I have 12 equals 9x plus 15. I'm going to subtract 15 from both sides. So I get negative 3, because 12 minus 15 gives me negative 3. Be careful with your negatives and positive. And then equals 9x. I divide both sides by 9. Now be careful here, because I know a lot of us would put just x equals negative 3. But remember, this is negative 3 over 9. So actually, x would equal negative 1/3. So be careful there when you simplify. Okay, now before I box this, as I did with example 1, I have to check to make sure that this answer works, that it's not extraneous. So in order to do that, I need to plug basically my negative 1/3 into both of the denominators. And if it works for both of them, that means it's a solution. So if I plug negative 1/3 into my first denominator, well, negative 1/3 plus 3, that basically just gives me 2 2/3. That works. Okay, and then if I plug negative 1/3 into my second denominator, that's going to give me negative 3 1/3. That works as well. So since I don't get 0 in any of the denominators, x equals negative 1/3 is a solution. Okay, let's go ahead, let's try number 3. So we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to cross multiply, do 1 times 11x plus 8. Now because this is a 1, you can just do 11x plus 8. You do not need to have that parentheses. You can if you want to, but remember, anytime we multiply anything by 1, we get the same value back. Now we're going to do x times 2x plus 5. Okay, this one we do need to distribute, so we have an x, and we're going to multiply by 2x and 5. So I get 11x plus 8 equals 2x squared plus 5x. Okay, now notice we have a quadratic because we have an x squared. So this is where we need to go back to the ideas of how can we solve quadratic equations. Okay, so one way is to factor. So remember, if we're going to use factoring, we have to set the equation equal to 0. We could use completing the square, but I would not recommend that. We could do the quadratic formula. So once again, if you want to use the quadratic formula, you got to set the equation equal to 0. The fourth way would be taking the square root on both sides, but in this case we cannot do it because we do have that middle term, or we have the x term. So we can't do that fourth way, okay? So that means you have two options, really, probably two prime options, factoring or quadratic formula. I would always check to see if you can factor, because that can usually be a little bit faster than using the quadratic formula. If you don't and you rather use quadratic formula, that's fine as well. Now for both of them, I do have to make sure I set my equation equal to 0. Now whatever I am really factoring, I want to keep my x squared positive. And you might want to do the same thing for when you do quadratic formula. It just makes it a little bit easier. So that means what I need to do is I need to subtract 11x from both sides. Make sure you put that underneath the correct like term. And then I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. Okay, so now our new formula, or what we are going to have for our equation, should I say, is we're going to have 0 equals 2x squared. And we do 5x minus 11x, that gives us minus 6x. And then we have minus 8. Okay, so remember to factor. The first thing we need to ask ourselves is, do these three terms have anything in common? Well, if I look, I can see that they all have a 2 in common. So I'm going to go ahead and factor that out. So I'm going to take a 2 out. So I'm going to go ahead and bring all of this up here to have more room. So when I do 2 divided by 2, I'm just left with x squared. And these three terms don't have any variables in common, so we keep that. So I do negative 6 divided by 2, that gives me minus 3, and then I'm left with an x. And then negative 8 divided by 2, that gives me minus 4. And then this is still equal to 0. Now, because we are solving this 2 in front, since there's no variable with it, really it's meaningless. It's not going to make sense if we do 2 equals 0. So because it's not really worth anything, I can divide both sides by this 2 to get rid of it. So this cancels out. And the reason really we're doing this is because there's no variable right next to that 2. Okay, so now I'm left with x squared minus 3x minus 4 equals 0. Notice that in 8.4, 8.5, and this section, we're factoring a lot. So hopefully we know how to factor by this time. Okay, so now we have 1 times 4 and 2 times 2. These are the factors of 4. Remember, we want to pick the pair that will add up to or subtract to 3. In this case, it's going to be 1 and 4. I'm going to go ahead and bring it back up here. So that means I'm going to have my x and x, 2 sets of parentheses, and make sure it's still equal to 0. The 1 and 4 works because we're going to subtract to get to, in this case, a negative 3, because we got to get to a negative 3. That means my bigger number, which is 4, is negative. My smaller is positive. I set each of these factors equal to 0 and solve. So I have x plus 1 equal to 0 and x minus 4 equal to 0. And then basically I solve for both. So I have x equals negative 1 and x equals 4. Now, before I box these to say these are my solutions, remember we have to plug both of these back into the denominators to make sure they work. And they have to work for both. If not, then they are extraneous. So let's check for negative 1. Let's plug it into the first denominator. I have 2 times a negative 1. That gives me negative 2. And then plus 5, that gives me a 3. So that works because we don't get 0 in the denominator. Now I'm going to do the same thing in my second. So I do 11 times negative 1. That gives me negative 11 plus 8. That gives me negative 3. So that works, okay, since I don't get 0. So x equals negative 1 is a solution. Now let's try 4. So I plug it into my first denominator. I do 2 times 4. That gives me 8. 8 plus 5 gives me 13. That works because we don't get 0. Now let's try it here. So I do 11 times 4. So that gives me 44. And then plus 8 gives me 52. So that works as well. So since we don't get 0 there, that means x equals 4 is also a solution. So that means here we get 2 solutions. So x equals -1 and x equals 4. Okay, so now we only have one more problem left. I would like you guys to go ahead and pause the video and try example 4. Okay, let's go ahead and go over this one. So as we've done before, we're going to cross multiply because we have one fraction, the equal symbol, into another fraction. So I'm going to do 8 times x. That just really gives me 8x. And then equals, I have 3 times our x minus 5. Here I'm going to use parentheses because remember my 3, I have to multiply by both the x and the 5. Okay, so I just have 8x, and then equals, I do 3 times x gives me 3x, and then 3 times a -5 gives me -15. I'm going to subtract 3x from both sides. So I do get 5x equals -15. Divide both sides by 5, and I get x equals -3. Now, before I say that is my solution, remember I need to plug it back into both of the denominators. So -3, when I plug it back into my first denominator, I have -3 minus 5. That gives me -8. We're good to go there. And when I plug -3 into x here, I just get -3. So since I don't get 0 in any of the denominators, x equals -3 is a solution. Okay, so make sure you work on the homework for this. Basically, it shouldn't be too bad. This should be the easier part of 8.6. Definitely don't forget to always check your answers because it is possible that you might have one solution, 2 solutions, or you won't have any solutions. So that means like the answer does not work. So definitely check for extraneous solutions there, okay? If you have any questions, make sure you contact me. I'll see you guys later. Bye.